He had sung hundreds of songs in his life, some loud, some wild, some playful, some heartbreaking. But there was one song Rod Stewart carried like a weight, a song fans kept begging him to sing, and one he quietly stepped away from, year after year. A song that made him freeze, a song that made his voice crack in ways even he couldn't control, a song he once performed so tenderly it brought entire arenas to silence. Yet behind closed doors, he admitted something he had never said publicly: "I don't want to talk about it." Most people thought that was just the title. They had no idea it was also a confession. Because every time Rod Stewart stepped up to the microphone and those first soft chords began, something inside him twisted, hard, not because of a relationship, not because of fame, and not because of any woman who broke his heart. The truth was darker, older, and it began long before he ever became Rod Stewart, the superstar. Before we go deeper into the story behind the song Rod Stewart Could Barely Face, make sure you're subscribed to RetroWaves, where the hidden truths, forgotten memories, and emotional struggles behind music's greatest names finally take the spotlight. The first time Rod Stewart heard "I Don't Want to Talk About It," he didn't just like it, he felt it. He felt the loneliness in the opening lines. He felt the exhaustion in the melody. He felt the ache of someone trying desperately to pretend they were fine while falling apart inside. Rod had always been that kind of singer, the kind who didn't just perform songs, but bled into them. So when he recorded his version in 1975, he delivered it with that whispering, fragile tone people rarely heard from him. It wasn't a rock anthem. It wasn't a showpiece. It was a wound. Fans thought they understood the pain, but they didn't, because the world assumed the song was about heartbreak, a breakup, a love gone wrong. And for years Rod let them believe it. But the truth was something he avoided explaining, something he shut down every time a journalist pushed for meaning. Why does this song sound so personal? Who were you singing about? Why do you look away every time you perform it live? Rod never answered directly. He would just shrug, smile faintly, and say the same line every time: "I don't want to talk about it." And no one realized he meant it literally until much later. Long before fame, before the faces, before the lights, Rod Stewart lived a life that was far from glamorous. He had seen people leave without warning, friends, first loves, even family members who drifted in and out of his world. He carried guilt for things he'd never admitted, moments when he wished he'd spoken up, moments when he wished he had been braver, moments when he wished he hadn't walked away. There was a period in his early life, one he rarely speaks about, when someone close to him fell into a darkness he didn't know how to pull them out of. A time when Rod was young, overwhelmed, and unprepared to deal with someone else's pain. He always wondered if he could have done more, said more, stayed longer. He always wondered if he'd abandoned someone who needed him, and that thought haunted him. So when he first sang "I Don't Want to Talk About It," it wasn't about the lyrics themselves, it was about the memories they unlocked. He could feel himself sliding back to that moment, that room, that silence, that final goodbye he couldn't bring himself to talk about publicly. The song's soft, trembling delivery wasn't a creative choice. It was instinct, a reaction, a memory, one that never went away. As Rod Stewart's fame skyrocketed, fans demanded the song constantly. They loved it. They called it his most emotional performance. They said he sang it like he was breaking in real time. But every performance took something out of him. There were nights he would start singing it, and halfway through he'd look down, touch his chest, and you could see it, the shift, the tightening, the moment he wasn't fully present anymore. His band knew the signs. Audience members saw it too. The way he would blink more slowly, the way he paused between lines as if searching for composure. It wasn't stage acting, it was someone trying not to drown. Eventually, Rod began quietly leaving the song off his set lists. Not officially, not with a statement, but subtly. Show after show, tour after tour, it disappeared. Fans wondered why. Some said he was tired of singing ballads. Some said he was bored of his older material. Others thought it might be because his voice changed over the years. But none of those were true. He simply could not face the song anymore. Not because of a breakup, not because of a woman, but because performing it forced him to remember something or someone he had spent his life trying to forget. Something connected to the song long before Rod ever touched it, because "I Don't Want to Talk About It" didn't begin with him. It began with a man whose story was far more tragic than any listener realized. a man whose final days were filled with silence, pain, and a loneliness deeper than the song itself. A man whose name the world didn't know yet, but whose shadow followed Rod Stewart every time he sang those words. And the truth behind that shadow was darker than anyone imagined, because the real story hadn't even started yet. Long before Rod Stewart stepped into a studio and wrapped his voice around "I Don't Want to Talk About It," another voice had already lived and died inside the song, a voice that never got the chance to grow old, a voice the world barely remembers today. But Rod felt him, even before he knew his name, because when Rod first heard the original recording, raw, trembling, fragile, he didn't hear a performance, he heard a cry, and something inside him responded to it, instantly, involuntarily, like a wound, recognizing another wound. People often say certain songs find the right singer, but this one didn't just find Rod Stewart, it attached itself to him, almost like a responsibility he never asked for, and the more he sang it, the heavier it became. The world didn't know it then, but the man who wrote "I Don't Want to Talk About It" was already slipping away by the time Rod heard it. He had written the song from a place Rod himself would understand only years later, a place where pain becomes so familiar, you learn to hide it in plain sight, where you say, "I'm fine," even when the truth is quietly killing you. The original singer had been young, younger than Rod when he first sang it. Talented, soft-spoken, a man whose voice sounded like it was collapsing under its own sadness. He belonged to a band that brushed shoulders with legends, yet lived in the shadows of giants. Rod didn't know the details then, not fully. He only sensed what anyone with a heart could sense. The person who wrote this song was suffering, but not in the way most people assumed. This wasn't heartbreak, this was despair. A despair Rod knew too well, because in his own early years, he saw people he cared about get swallowed by the same darkness, some by poverty, some by pressure, some by addiction, and some by something much quieter, the feeling that no one was listening. Rod carried memories of people who slipped away without explanation. He carried guilt for not knowing how to help them, and when he sang this song, it felt like he was being forced to face all of that again. What he didn't know yet was that the man behind the song, the man whose words were now tied to Rod forever, was living through a downfall more tragic than anyone around him understood. A downfall that would soon end in a death so sudden, so devastating, that it would cast a shadow over the song for decades. When Rod recorded the track in 1975, something unusual happened. Most songs went through multiple takes, adjustments, arrangements, but with this one, he barely touched it, barely pushed it, barely changed a thing. He sang it like the song told him what to do, not the other way around. The producer later described the session as eerily quiet, no joking around, no swagger, no typical Rod energy, just a man singing something that didn't feel like his, yet somehow felt like home. Listeners noticed it immediately. Rod's voice wasn't powerful in this song. It wasn't raspy or loud or playful. It was fragile, almost trembling, and that fragility wasn't acting. Behind the scenes, Rod had been dealing with the pressure of success, the exhaustion of constant touring, the fear of losing himself in the machine he'd worked so hard to escape. He knew what it felt like to pretend, to smile in public and unravel in private, to look fine on the outside while carrying something heavy inside. So when he sang, "I Don't Want to Talk About It," it didn't feel like a lyric, it felt like a confession. To this day, whenever he's asked why he never pushed the song harder, promoted it aggressively, or kept performing it, he gives the same answer: it's just too emotional. But the deeper truth was still waiting for him, a truth he would stumble into slowly, quietly, and almost by accident, because after his version began gaining attention, someone finally told him what had happened to the man who originally wrote the song, and that's when Rod understood why it haunted him. It happened not long after Rod released his version, a casual comment from someone in the industry. A story mentioned in passing, a name he didn't recognize yet. But the details, they stopped him cold. The original songwriter had been young, shockingly young, when he died. His final months were a spiral of addiction, confusion, and heartbreak. He had been fired from the band he helped create. He had been given one last chance, and he died the night he was supposed to start over. His body was found in a small room, alone, unnoticed, gone before anyone realized he needed help. Rod's reaction was immediate and strange. He didn't say much. He didn't ask questions. He didn't push for stories. He just went quiet, the same quiet that filled him whenever he tried performing the song. because suddenly the painful memories he carried from his own past didn't feel personal anymore. They felt mirrored, reflected in someone else's tragedy, someone who died with the same words Rod kept avoiding: "I don't want to talk about it." And from that moment on, the song wasn't simply emotional for Rod Stewart. It felt like he was singing another man's final thoughts, another man's unfinished goodbye, another man's regret, a regret Rod understood far too well, but he still didn't know the full story. Not yet, because the name of that man, the young songwriter whose death would haunt Rod Stewart long after, had not been spoken aloud, not to him, not to the world, not in a way that truly explained the darkness behind the song. And when the truth finally reached him, it was worse than he ever expected. For months, Rod carried nothing but fragments of the truth, scattered details, whispers, half-remembered comments from people who barely understood the story themselves. A young man, a tragic ending, a song written from a place no one could save him from, but no one told Rod the name, not yet. It was almost as if the universe was protecting him, delaying the moment when he would finally connect the song he loved with the life behind it, and the death that shadowed it. But one night, quietly, casually, someone finally said it. A musician Rod knew from the early days. Not a close friend, not a gossip, just someone who happened to be there during a moment that changed everything. He said the name gently, almost respectfully, like saying it too loudly would disturb something sacred. Danny Whitten. The room went still. Rod didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even blink right away. Because even though he had never met Danny, something about the name felt heavy, as if it belonged to someone who had carried more pain than he ever deserved, as if Rod had been singing his story without knowing it, and then slowly the rest of the story came out, piece by piece, pain by pain, a life unraveling in the background of a world that barely noticed. Danny Whitten wasn't famous. He didn't have the swagger or spotlight Rod eventually earned, but he had something else, something rarer, something far more fragile. He had a heart that felt too much. Danny was a member of Crazy Horse, the band that performed with Neil Young, and in the early years, his talent stood out. His voice wasn't loud or polished, but it was honest, painfully honest. You could hear every bruise, every memory, every secret he never dared to share. He wrote, "I don't want to talk about it," during one of the darkest periods of his life, a time when addiction was slowly tightening its grip around him, a time when he was drifting away from the people who loved him, a time when he was searching for a way out and failing. Danny's bandmates saw the changes. Neil Young saw it too. One day, after Danny could no longer keep up in rehearsals, Neil had no choice but to let him go. Those who knew the story said it broke Danny in ways no one fully understood, because for Danny, music wasn't a job. It was the only place he ever felt safe, and being removed from it felt like losing himself entirely. He spiraled quickly, painfully, tragically. His final months were a blur of confusion and dependence, the kind that traps a person in their own mind. People tried to help. They offered support, money, treatment, but Danny was already slipping too far, too fast. On the night he died, he was supposed to start a new chapter, a rehab program, a chance at recovery. But instead, he disappeared into the quiet, and when they found him, it was already too late. He was just 29. Rod would later say he didn't need all the details. He didn't want the sensational versions or the gossip. All he needed was the truth. A young man wrote a song from the edge and never made it back. And suddenly, Rod understood why the song always felt so heavy, why he felt that strange ache whenever he performed it, why the melody lingered long after the last note. He wasn't just singing sadness, he was singing someone's final pain. After learning Danny's name, after connecting the world he came from with the words he left behind, Rod Stewart began changing the way he approached the song. He still loved it. He still admired the writing. He still respected its fragile beauty. But singing it, that became something else. He felt like he was intruding on a story that wasn't his, a goodbye that wasn't meant for him, a wound he couldn't heal. Fans thought Rod was emotional because of a woman. They were wrong. He was emotional because he realized he was carrying the last words of someone who never got the chance to grow old. Someone whose pain echoed a feeling Rod himself knew from his younger years, the fear of losing someone you care about long before you're ready. Rod always said he had regrets, moments he wished he had handled differently with people who slipped through his fingers, people he couldn't save. And now, here he was, singing the words of a man who slipped away completely. Every performance felt heavier, every line felt sharper, every whisper felt like it belonged to someone else's ghost. Eventually, quietly, Rod started letting the song fade from his shows. He didn't announce it. He didn't explain it. He didn't owe anyone an explanation. Not for something so private, so emotional, so deeply tied to a stranger he never met yet somehow felt connected to. And whenever interviewers asked why he didn't sing it anymore, his answer stayed the same. I don't want to talk about it. Most people thought he was teasing them, but he wasn't. He truly couldn't talk about it. Not without stirring the memories he'd spent years trying to leave behind, his own and Danny's, because behind the song's soft melody was a truth even darker than Danny's death, a truth Rod didn't understand until much later when he learned what really inspired the lyrics Danny wrote, a truth that explained the trembling voice, the haunting tone, the unbearable sadness that seeped through every line. A truth so personal, so heartbreaking, it changed the way Rod Stewart heard the song forever, and once he understood that truth, he knew he could never sing it again. Rod Stewart always knew, "I don't want to talk about it," felt heavier than other songs. But he didn't understand why until he learned the truth behind the lyrics, the truth Danny Whitten never got the chance to explain. Fans believed the song was about heartbreak. It wasn't. It came from a place darker than any breakup. It came from abandonment, fear, and a silence Danny carried his entire life. Danny Whitten didn't just struggle with addiction. He struggled with feeling unwanted, unanchored, left behind by people he loved, long before drugs took over. Friends said Danny never truly believed he mattered. Every time someone walked away, it shattered him in ways he couldn't talk about. So he wrote the one line that summed up his whole life: "I don't want to talk about it." Not as romantic pain, but as a shield for wounds he never healed. When Rod first recorded the song, he didn't know any of this, but later, when he finally heard what Danny lived through, the trembling delivery of the original recording made perfect sense. It wasn't singing, it was someone quietly breaking. Rod Stewart never claimed the song was about him, but he did carry regrets from his early life, regrets he rarely spoke about, people he lost, people he couldn't help, people who slipped into darkness while he was too young, too overwhelmed, or too frightened to know what to do. So when he learned what Danny felt, what Danny feared, what Danny carried, Rod recognized the emotion immediately. He had lived his own version of that silence, and when he sang Danny's words, he wasn't just interpreting a song, he was reopening his own memories, not romantic ones, the painful kind you spend decades trying to forget. There was a rehearsal, simple, quiet, where Rod tried singing the song again after learning Danny's story. He sang the first line. That was as far as he got. He lowered the microphone, took a breath, shook his head, not because he couldn't sing it, but because he suddenly realized the truth. He was no longer singing for himself. He was singing for a young man who died believing no one heard him, and Rod couldn't carry that weight anymore. Not night after night, not under the lights, not with the memories it stirred Danny's and his own. So he walked away from the song, quietly, privately, without explaining a thing. Rod never made a statement. He never told fans why the song disappeared from his shows. He simply let it go, because some songs aren't meant to live forever on stage. Some songs belong to the people who wrote them, even if the world discovers them through someone else. Rod loved the song, but he respected Danny more, and he understood something most people never realized. The song wasn't just a ballad, it was a final confession, a final cry from someone who didn't know how to ask for help, a final truth Danny couldn't say out loud, a truth Rod felt every time he tried to sing it. "I'm hurting, but I can't talk about it." People still ask Rod Stewart why he won't perform it again, why this song, out of all his classics, is the one he avoids. And the answer, the real answer, is simple: because some pain doesn't belong on a stage, because some stories aren't meant to be reopened, because the song reveals regrets he carries quietly and a tragedy he never lived but deeply understands. So whenever someone asks him for the truth, he gives the only honest answer he can: "I don't want to talk about it."